policies and gamut policy programs from 2017 to 2021. Bob now serves as the Chief Legal Counsel and provides legal advice and representation to school districts and county offices of education on various education issues, and also provides guidance for the Education Legal Alliance, supporting CSBA's members in litigation and issues of statewide significance to California school districts and county offices of education. Bob is licensed in California, the state of Washington, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Federal Court of Claims in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining CSBA, he was a founding partner of Jackson and Turk, a small law office in Plumas County that focused on environmental law and matters affecting families, children, and the local community. Turk also served on the governing boards of the Plumas Unified School District and County Office of Education, and spent 2 years as the president of the Plumas County Bar Association. Last, but certainly not least, we have Keith Bray. Keith is in his second tour with the California School Boards Association, serving as General Counsel and Chief of Staff since May 2020. Previously, Keith served as CSBA's General Counsel from 2011 to 2017. Mr. Bray rejoined CSBA with more than 2 decades of experience in private practice, representing school districts and county offices of education, with a particular focus on collective bargaining. Since returning to CSBA, Bray has advised the CEO and executive director and the board of directors on issues of corporate governance and operations, in addition to authoring numerous articles on legal topics for CSBA publications, managing the legal review of sample policies and regulations prepared by CSBA, and serving as a member of the Education Legal Alliance Steering Committee, of which he was formerly a director of the ELA. So thank you all for joining us. I look forward to what you have to add to the conversation. With no further ado, I will turn it over to Keith.
Thank you, Troy. I think we all appreciate our introductions. It was, I think, a very thorough look at the individuals that we have, and we're going to share their stories and their information with you all today about that very important practice that we engage in public schools, which is collective bargaining. We have our partnerships with our labor partners are most important as we work together to provide the education to the children and the young adults that we serve. This afternoon, we're going to spend some time before we all know we're back to school and bargaining tables are getting dusted off, and we're about ready to begin for the coming year. Maybe some of you are still continuing from last year. All of that being said, we thought we would spend some time this afternoon on talking really about what the role of the board is in negotiations. We think that's a good way to set the foundation for the discussions that we're going to have for you this afternoon. I'd like to start with Cherise, who's our board member from William S. Hart, and have her start with a little bit about how she sees the role of the board, and then we'll work our way through the panel for their so they can deliver their thoughts as well. Cherise?
Good afternoon, and thank you, Keith, for the opportunity to get started as we think about the role of the board in this very important conversation that we're having today about collective bargaining. And my experience, as I look at the role of the board, it's really clear and easy to start with just one piece, and that is remembering that one of our main responsibilities as board members is to ensure the fiscal health of the districts that we are serving in. And in doing that, when you consider collective bargaining and negotiations, you also want to know that your role in that overarching piece of setting the fiscal health means that you are not necessarily directly engaged in negotiations as they are happening. You want to be able to set the direction of where the district is headed and have collective bargaining feed into that process. I'm very fortunate in my district that we have a strategic plan in place that was just approved and adopted by the board this summer, and it really sets our goals for the next 5 years in place for where we are going to go. And you use that to help you set the direction, and it can be the driving tool for the conversations that will happen as you are starting your collective bargaining. And you really focus on that being a positive relationship that's in place, one that is built around and focused on trust. That is a really critical component of it. You want to establish the parameters and the structure, and you want to be able to give authority of what negotiations can look like with your staff and team members who are at the table. Again, setting an environment that is positive and built around trusting relationships, ensuring that the climate is one that supports negotiations happening in a positive way, and that you're setting the tone around the expectations of what you want to see, ensuring that you can continue to bring back decisions that are made to your role as it relates to fiscal health and responsibility of the district that you are in. I shared in one of the conversations that I had with some folks in this group that what you don't want is that it ends up being like you're at a car dealership, something where you are having a conversation that seems to go back and forth. And you as a board member, you get to set that expectation of those who are negotiating on behalf of the district and at the table. And then you are also the community representative. So the person who people are going to come to with questions, you are the person who are, you may get the emails, you may get the phone calls when things may not seem to be going as some folks would want them to go. And your role as the board member is to often redirect and remind that you are not at the table and you are not negotiating. Your role is to maintain true confidentiality of what the authority that you've given is, and to ensure again that the tone, the trust, the fiscal responsibility, fiduciary responsibility is clear. And part of that setting the trust is things that you do to make sure that everyone knows everything that's available, the way in which you have the budget looked at, the way that your strategic plan drives what your decisions will be. So that's some of how I would start this conversation.
I think you just captured a lot in the few minutes that you just provided with your experience. So thank you, Cherise. I'm going to remind everybody that Cherise is with the William S. Hart Union High School District. Josh, you've had 2 terms on Berkeley Unified. You're now involved with collective bargaining with Oakland Unified. How about weighing in on the role of the board member?
So I just to add on to what Cherise said, I thought you did a great job sort of laying out a lot of the key pieces. I guess one thing I'll add is, the actual negotiations themselves, of course, are not the purview of the board, just like the actual daily operations of the district are not the purview of the board. The general vision for how you want negotiations to go certainly is, at least to some extent, within the board's purview, obviously informed quite a bit by, your CBO, your superintendent, as well as, of course, labor partners and your community. So one example of that is to, and I think, I'm not relaying anything confidential here, but I think we all know this, that we need to increase compensation for employees. Not only is it just in general an important thing to do, but it's a highly competitive market. And we, the inflation, all the other things that are affecting our, sort of communities these days necessitate that. And so how do you balance that real need with expanding program, with maintaining a balanced budget? And that balancing act is going to be unique for each board, for each community. And so making sure that, you as a board get a chance early on to have those discussions in closed session with your key staff, individual board members going out and asking community members and constituents what they feel, how would they balance those benefits? Explaining that you can't have all three, at least not in most years. I think that is a role that the board can play, but it needs to be done early on. It can't be done when the superintendent or CBO or whoever is negotiating for you sort of brings you back the final, agreed TA. Actually, no, I don't like that. I want something different. Making sure that you as a board member are in touch and understand the timeline and when it is proper for the board to have those discussions so that you're not feeling surprised. Your negotiating team isn't feeling surprised. I would say that, that's a key piece of it as well.
Thanks, Josh. Hey, I'll go to the other former board member we have, Bob Turk, who was served on the Plymouth Unified School District, and it was unique in this state. We have 7 of them where they're both a school district and a county board. Bob, your thoughts about the role of the board in negotiations?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. And to Cherise's point, really setting the direction is key, and knowing how you're going to set that direction, I think, is real important. And also, Josh touched on this with the highly competitive market, right? Like, you have to prepare as a board member, even though you're not going to be at the table. That's not your role, but your role is to set the general direction, and you have to know sort of where you're coming from to do that. So one thing that I did as a board member, one thing that I recommend other board members do is, remember what your goals are, what's in your strategic plan, what's in your LCAP, and how does that inform the direction you're giving. Know your budget. You got to know your budget, right? So you can understand what can you offer, what can't you offer, sort of where are you at in that. And your CBO is going to play a critical role in that. But you should also have a pretty good understanding, especially in this competitive market, of what's your neighbor doing, right? Because you're bargaining with your union, but your union has that information from across the state. And so you should probably be armed with a similar set of facts, right? So you can know what's the neighboring district paying, what's a similarly situated district somewhere else in the state paying, and where are they at in the bargaining process, because that is going to come into play from the other side. One way you can do that is if you're a legal services member, you can access, we have a database that you can access. It has now, I think we just went over 10,000 documents in there of searchable salary schedules, collective bargaining agreements, all those kind of things that you can use to help you prepare. So I recommend, if you haven't used that resource, it's a good resource as you're preparing for bargaining. And then also your policies, right? I'm a policy guy, so I always go back to policies. There's a set of policies that are specific to collective bargaining, 4140. It's 4140 through 4143.1. And then there's 4243 that go with that as well, depending on who you're bargaining with. But those policies are good resources for board members to read up on as they're going into this process, to help them remember what is their role, what do they sunshine, when do they sunshine it, how do they interact with the community during this process. So I would just add preparation.
Thanks, Bob. I'd like to finish this first section with talking with our 2 panel members who work with their board members. I'd like to start with, in labor relations, I'd like to start with Giovani, who's superintendent, and what's his viewpoint of the role of the board in negotiations?
Well, I want to thank the panel here. Obviously, they brought in a lot of the good points of moving forward in that principle, in that process. One thing I'm going to take back to basics. Sometimes we always criticize in public industry or public education, why couldn't it run like a private industry, and how come private industry look at productivity a little bit different than us? But in reality, there's a comparison there. If we go back down and start thinking about our employees, really, they are the ones who, without them, there's no really productivity. And it doesn't matter what you do in the organization. So in our situation here at Upper Lake, as we came together as a newly unified school district 6 years ago, and 5 years ago, we started establishing the organization literally from scratch. The board and the soup, together we came and we went back down to the basic of understanding a core value. And I think every single board should have some kind of core value when it comes down to the employees and how they are being treated. So we focus on 2 core values, and you can steal them, no problem. I think this is probably valuable for that one. Is we came together and we said, okay, we want best working conditions, we want best compensation possible, with a strong certified positive budget. So this is on the forefront for anything we start doing. And that is coupled in parallel to obviously our strategic plan with what is going to be done for the kids. So where sometimes we get caught often in kids first, and this is what is good for kids also, but the delivery system for those kids is our bus drivers and our noon aides and our teachers and everybody else who deliver that productivity. So I love what Josh said earlier, is the fact that we have to be real. There's a high need, and we have to be focused on the quality of life in today's age is associated with two things: time and compensation. And if we can make that a presence in our discussion as board, superintendent, cabinet, CBO, then that takes us to another level of how we're going to come into that negotiation. And the board, if that is something they can believe in and they have a core value, that will draw the point from where we start moving into negotiation. Everything else already been said. Thank you so much, Dr. Moore. I think she wrapped it up beautifully.
Thank you, Giovani. Hey, Daniel. Daniel is the Director of Employee Relations at San Juan Unified School District here in the Sacramento area. Daniel, your thoughts about the role of the board?
Keith, thanks for having us today. And I want to double down on a couple of themes from how Dr. Moore kicked us off today. I heard really kind of three primary buckets where my experience in San Juan Unified, and when you talk about the board's role in collective bargaining and negotiations, they're really almost kind of three anchors. One is that setting the tone and creating those parameters. What are your core principles that are always your redirect in any conversation you're having with your professional partners? There's trusting your superintendent and staff to take those anchors and take the ball and run with it. And then there is creating space for ongoing feedback loops. So we're at the table right now, but when we are not in formal bargaining, my superintendent and I are in closed session every other week because we're talking about the things that move us from interest-based or collaboration to partnership-based, so that they can see the long-term return on investment in working with our bargaining unit partners as professional partners in the work and providing service to our students. So our board sees that if we maintain fiscal health and responsibility, stable leadership, and they trust us to enter into those conversations at the beginning point of decisions with our bargaining unit partners. What's the cliche? If you want a soft landing, include us in the launch. They see the returns on that investment even before we get to the table to start talking about total compensation. So we've been able to do some really great things for our students before COVID, during COVID, and certainly in this historic time when we have record-setting investments from the state in public education. We look forward to continuing those positive dialogues.
Thanks, Daniel. We were going to take questions and answers at the end, but I did notice one was in the chat, which was about a subject that we all kind of warmed up on before we turned the screens on at 2 o'clock. And that is, what are the benefits or disbenefits of having a board member serve on the negotiation team? The question came in from a district where the board members sit on the bargaining table. And as we talked about, some of us are familiar with being at bargaining tables where there are board members. But why don't we send it around the horn here, whoever would like to start on. I know it's not part of our training, when we do our governance training, which we have with our masters in governance, and we have sessions at our annual education conference. It's not something that we recommend as a best practice, but there are bargaining models, interest-based bargaining for one, where board members are a part of the team. So let me send it around the horn. Who'd like to take the first shot? All righty then.
Like who's going to take this?
Go ahead, Giovani. You want to take the first shot?
Fine. Yeah. I mean, I think we all echo the same feeling on this. Again, it's a personal choice for people how they see that position and what does it fulfill for their, for their capacity building as a board member. I don't know, from experience and from professional approach, I think there's less benefits than benefits and sitting on there, because the focus becomes the board member.
Yes.
And when you take the focus, you know, you show up in there in that room, every single person shows up with them as a person, but also they show up as a position or a title. And you cannot disconnect the two. So when you go into those rooms, you want to come in from a place of a person and feeling the process of trust and respect and admiration and all that, you know, going through. There's always this thing in the back of the head as people trying to figure out which audience they're going to speak to. So if you have a negotiator on the table from the district side who is superintendent or assistant superintendent of HR or whoever it is, they're going to be watching the dynamics, and then I guess the conversation ends up being to the board member versus being to the substance of what we're trying to achieve on goals. And I'll leave the rest for somebody else to jump in.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we talked about the need of the board member to have the upper level, the helicopter view, so to speak. Anybody else have a thought on that would be helpful for the person that asked the question? Cherise?
I have a thought on it. I don't know if it's going to be helpful or not, but it is one in which I think, as Dr. Giovani said, you have to maintain a safe space and distance with your role as a board member, and what that means in terms of your, as you were saying, that helicopter view. When you are considering having a board member at the table, and it's not something I would recommend. It is not something that in practice I think is easily done to maintain that distance and space. I'm guessing it can be done successfully, but I think it adds an extra level of burden and maybe stress, maybe leveraging the role to a degree that it might tarnish the process that should be happening when you are negotiating and at the table. And I think it's similar to, I used to work for the district that I am now a school board member on, and I had to quit my job when I became a board member. I think it's similar to that. You can't really keep the separation of the two very easily.
So, and you brought up something earlier, and maybe the panel can share their experiences too. And it kind of comes along the lines of when a board member is involved, then the board member is part of the report out to the board, as opposed to coming from more of an independent bargaining team. What about the experience that when negotiations aren't going well, board members are going to get the calls, right? And they're going to get the calls and the complaints. And how should a board member, you touched on it, Cherise, earlier, how should a board member handle that?
Well, I don't think there's a perfect answer, but I will say the honest answer that I can give is you are going to get a lot of calls, a lot of emails, and it's going to push you in some ways to want to know what's happening. What did I miss? What's going on? And so that's where you have those trusting relationships with the superintendent, with your assistant superintendent, your CBO, those who are at the table who have all of the information and the full picture, because there's always two sides of a story, right? And so you get this flush of emails and calls that share one side of it, but because you trust in your leadership, you're going to hear the other side of it. And so your role as a board member is to, one, listen, always make sure that the labor groups understand that you are there to support and listen to them, and that you want to make sure that you have a district in which you are retaining highly qualified expert staff that feel valued, and at the same time understand what your parameters are for what you really can do. And so when that happens, my typical response is, thank you so much for sharing this information, this perspective. It is something that we are all looking to reach some level of agreement on. And I am not at the table nor directly involved in negotiating. And so knowing that, please know that I'm listening, but that is about where that conversation ends. And then I share that information with those at the table, with my superintendent, who I think is on the webinar. And I want to just give a quick shout out to Mr. Mike Coleman, who is a superintendent for the William S. Hart Union High School District, who's doing a phenomenal job in helping to really build those trusting relationships, so that then when I have that conversation about, I got 25 emails, or not 25, 250 emails, that he's not surprised, and he's already in many cases shared with me what he can to let me know what's happening, so that I'm not also surprised when I get those. And then again, we set the parameters. We give the authority of what can happen, what's feasible, what's realistic within the budget. One way to help to build that trust, though, so that you aren't at the receiving end of those emails and those calls, is to make sure that everyone knows what's happening. And that's, again, knowing your budget and wanting to make sure that your labor groups know and understand the budget too, trusting your business, your CBO, your chief business official, with their work on the budget. We have budget study sessions open, designed just so that we can have our labor groups really walk through and see what's available, so that there's no secrets, there's no surprises.
Try to all, at least your level best to be using the same numbers.
Yes.
Anybody else? We're going to transition, but with respect, yeah.
So I got a quick thing just to throw in, Keith.
Oh.
The other thing that does when you've got a board member on the bargaining table is you've now created that board member, as Giovani was talking about, as an individual instead of as a member of the board, right? So that creates a couple of things. One, the board only acts as a body, and now you've got one person with information that the rest of the board
knows a lot more,
have,
right? Absolutely.
right? Now you've got a problem in your deliberations, and it just isn't the best practice for a board as an entity to make decisions together. But then when you think about these phone calls, and when Cherise said 25, I was like, there's no way you only get 25 emails with 22,000 students. But anyone who's been on a board knows you're going to get a lot of these calls, a lot of these questions. And if you're on that negotiating table, it's going to be really hard to draw that line between subjects that have been sunshined and negotiations that you can't talk
Oh,
about.
there you go. Well,
Right?
So what do you mean by that? What do you mean by subjects that have been sunshine? Just what do you mean by that?
Right. So at the beginning of the bargaining process, we
Okay.
sunshine our topics that we're going to be discussing, but we don't go into the details of this is what we're going to offer, this is what we can accept. That all of that's happening behind closed doors.
And those are your parameters, those are your limitations, right?
Exactly. And if you're at the table and you know these things, right, because you're discussing those parameters, it's tough as a human being to draw that red line and not accidentally breach that confidentiality, which is crucial to the process.
Thank you, Bob. Josh, I saw you raise your hand.
Thanks, Keith. Just to add a little bit, my own individual perspective and experience. So when I first started as a board, I very much wanted to be part of negotiations. There's a little arrogant of me, like, oh, I just got elected. I know labor, they endorse me.
I got this down. I got this down.
Exactly right. I'm going to go in and I'm going to help. And having come off the board and now, working in a district, sort of on the administration side, I see how, how challenging that can be, as Dr. Moore and Mr. Turk, mentioned. And I'll just say that I think that the motivation that I came with, and my sense is the motivation of any board member who wants to be part, is a good motivation. But that's the place where you want to locate it. So you go to your soup and you say, okay, explain to me why you want to be part of negotiations. And probably what it will come down to is that you don't fully trust the negotiations to reflect your values as a board member, or you're worried that it will sort of have blowback on you as a board member. All very legitimate and appropriate concerns. So that's where you then locate your conversation in closed session with your board members and with your superintendent. And you can say, look, Superintendent Bray, I don't know you well enough. I'm hearing from my, friends in the street and, I'm getting these emails that you're like being, really hard and not appreciating the value of employees. So that's really where the conversation needs to be located. It's not solved by you going to the table. It is solved by a more open and honest conversation with your superintendent and staff. And then I'll just give one minor anecdote because I think it's helpful. We are before PERB right now. I'm not saying anything that is not public. There is a situation where a board member did not attend the bargaining table, but during negotiations had conversations with labor. That person is now being called as a witness in the PERB matter, alleging that that person was actually negotiating. Now, of course, they weren't, but so board members need to be very, very, very careful, even whether they're not even at the table, but certainly at the table, that they could be called as a witness and they could potentially undermine the very position that they're trying to support. And this could happen years later because, contracts are 3 or 4 years. So you may go in wanting to be the savior, the person to do it. And you may come out 3 or 4 years later being the cause of really significant, problems for your board and for your district. So I just want to really, urge board members who, like me, had that desire to, to really understand where it's coming from and find other ways, to get at that legitimate desire.
And I think you really raise a corollary point, which is, we started out talking about, board members on the team. It's almost more risky for them personally if they're having what could be, like you just described, discussions, answering questions, being somehow in these conversations, whether it's labor holding those conversations or a board member or administration. It's called side bargaining, and it's an unfair labor practice. So you have to be very careful. Anything else before we move on to the next subject area? So it's one that we had talked about back in a couple of months back when we started planning for this webinar. Anything changed since the state of emergency went into effect in March 2020? Is there anything? Certainly we all went through a period of extreme change, and I started bargaining on Zoom like everybody else. But here we are. It's August of 2022. Is there anything that because of what we've gone through in the last couple of years, is there anything that you think has fundamentally changed in the way parties are negotiating? And if that's not, that means we're still in our typical system. Daniel?
Keith, I'm happy to jump in on that, and I'm in a unique spot in which I came into my role in year 2 of the pandemic, where the district and our labor partners had already had about a year under their belt. I think, like the COVID-19 pandemic has intensified existing conditions, for better or for worse, and tested relationships. I think that our system and our partners would tell you that it certainly tested those relationships and it strengthened them for the better in some of the most intense ways. I can tell you the culture that I walked into as we prepared for the 21-22 school year was that we were meeting almost daily. We were not exchanging proposals for some of the things and challenges we were trying to navigate. We were creating joint Google documents with our labor partners and writing them together to discuss things like the teacher shortage and health and safety guidelines and incentive pay for people to work their prep so that we could have credentialed teachers in front of students to start the school year. Those are 3 examples of about the 72, 73 side MOUs that we wrote last year just to get through the school year. But where we already had existing conditions for a culture of collaboration, and I'm not going to say that it hasn't gotten hard or it didn't get really hard before I came on. If you were starting with a strong baseline and conditions for success and trust, then you were able to build upon that, and we've continued to carry that forward.
Thanks, Dan. Anybody else? Let's then really turn now, if we can, to what lies ahead this year. It's like everything else, I mean, we have almost 1,000 school districts and county offices of education in California, and everybody's at a different stage. Some of our districts, some of these panel members have already settled a contract for this year. Some are still working on last year's, or maybe even the year before. But we are looking forward to 22 and 23 and it is a fairly remarkable budgetary year. I'm sure that many on not just the panel but are watching today have already, been involved in the different seminars of folks that are telling us, okay, well, really, what did that June budget mean? Well, it meant about a 12.8% increase in ongoing money, whether it's COLA or an increase to the base LCFF, and then about almost 17 billion in one-time money. It meant an increase of Prop 98 of our guarantee of about 17 billion. But when we bargain, right, we're all looking out at the 3-year, we've got to be able, the superintendent and the board and the CFO have got to be able to sign the disclosure that we can afford it for 3 years. So we're always casting out ahead. And we know that the money came in from the state this year. We have a 9% inflation rate. No longer are we forgiven paying STRS and PERS. So if you look at a net increase, there's some talk there. So I think that when we're going to talk now about some of the subjects that we think might be at bargaining tables this year, and certainly this panel's idea about that. We'll start with compensation and benefits, but there are corollaries to that, right? We've got teacher shortage. We're going to invest into teacher retention. All of that kind of comes into this compensation area. So is there somebody here that would like to start? I'm going to start with Giovani because I know that you've got a story to tell. Obviously we've got about 20 minutes that we can speak on this subject. So
I'm going to link basically what Daniel and kind of tap in on what Josh finished with the last comment he said, because Josh echoed back, but really went back to this first loop is you have to have core values that the board believe in, because that really drives why somebody want to be on the board, on the negotiation table from the board. Goes back to that, what is the purpose? So when we established those core values, we knew where we're going to go. I have to say we're blessed in here that not only we settled early on for this year from last year, but because of that core value, best working condition and best compensation possible under a strong positive certified budget. When the money came, we literally on our own, we didn't have to go back to the table, didn't have to ask, didn't have to do any of this. We literally went on our last board meeting. We went to our attorneys through the light language. We did it by MOU, and we just pushed our, whatever it was, 4% for this year to 7%. We've been able to do in the last 5 years a compounded, I think, 27 or 28% raises for our teachers, considering that before they unified, the teachers that went for 6 years with no raises. So, by coming in and doing strong zero budgeting, and that's where it starts. Really starts, we have it in our notes. It starts with understanding the budget. We really know what the budget is and being so transparent. I love what Cherise said, Dr. Moore earlier, that those workshops to make sure we're completely transparent, the same numbers. You do that and you continue it year after year. And in Upper Lake, we do zero budgeting every single year. We start from scratch every single year, because this way the fat is trimmed and we know what we're focusing on. So by doing that, you can really plan ahead and see where the money is going in, and we know exactly what we can give. So we settled already, and the best compliment you can ever have in your career, and I thought I will never have that compliment ever, is when you have a bargaining entity who came in the district 5 years ago, because they didn't exist in the district at that time, and they have a 3-year opening, right? For this year, the whole contract is open. When they come, they say, "You gave us everything. You gave us everything we want in the last couple of years. Can we change the dates?" And your bargaining is literally 20 seconds long on a phone call, with an email, you change the date, and that's how you go. When you reach that point, when you are in that place, that is the best achievement across the board by everybody who's doing that. And there's a way of getting there, but it's for a conversation for another time.
Sure.
But this is where you want to get to, is where you are stuck. You're really focusing on those values, and you deliver on them consistently. I'll turn it over to the rest of the
Thank you. So, number of subjects we can talk about. I mean, that's a success story, and that's built on a very strong foundation, a very strong relationship between the leadership teams of both the employees and of the district. What about the one-time money? How is that coming in? Are we expecting, if you're experiencing declining enrollment, are we expecting that to come into the bargaining tables? What are your thoughts on some of them? And I'll defer to those that are at the bargaining tables. Daniel, I think you're getting ready to talk. There we go.
I'll jump in briefly. I mean, I think that the whole package of the investments that we're seeing from the state, whether they're ongoing or one time, the impact all depends on your local context. For us, it really gives us some creative conversations to have about how we not only remain a destination district in recruitment and retention of high quality employees, but also how we enhance and extend some of the additional supports for our students that ultimately benefit bargaining unit members when we're able to say, add services, add supports, wraparound services so that they can focus on their core jobs. It gives us some flexibility, and we were able to put together through ELO and ESSER funding, really a 3-year plan, for instance, that is still ongoing as opposed to spending it all at once. We put together a 3-year plan where we've been able to add instructional assistants, add their hours, and add their FTE in the classroom. I use that as one example where now that we're looking at learning recovery block grant money, ELO-P ongoing that allows us to continue to enhance and extend our before and after school programs. All of those additional supports that are provided by historic funding allows us to do strike more of that balance that one of the panelists talked about earlier, where you want to improve working conditions, you want to improve non-compensation types of support for students, but you also want to make sure that your district is a destination for in that total compensation space for the best in the profession, whether they're in the classroom or outside of it. So we want to be prudent with our one-time funds, obviously, and that's a core value of our board. We don't want to make promises that we can't keep down the road or have a day of reckoning that's going to impact human beings and ultimately impact students, whether that's through layoffs, or if we do make commitments, then we want to be partners with our bargaining units in helping manage those expectations over the long term, that we're going to have to have some conversations in 2 or 3 years. And fortunately, again, because of stability and leadership, a track record of fiscal responsibility and a board that trusts their superintendent and staff, we're able to maintain that trust with our bargaining unit partners, and they will carry that message forward when those days come.
Another success story.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on real quick to what Daniel was saying there about making commitments. I think that's and working through those once you've made that commitment, right? So thinking about working conditions, for example, Giovani, I think it was Giovani had mentioned that earlier, and Daniel mentioned they had 72 MOUs during the COVID situation. That working conditions piece for my end of things, right? I'm not at the table, but I see some of the stuff that happens afterwards. Following through on those MOUs is a critical piece to all of this right now. I mean, the working conditions and masking and vaccines have got to be challenges at the table that are pretty unique for you guys who are there right now. But making sure that you follow through on that commitment and don't act unilaterally as a board when you're sitting there in the face of that pressure of an angry mob at your meetings saying, no, we want masks removed or we want masks added. Go back to those MOUs and make sure you're adhering to those.
Well, I think that's well said, and it is. We are bargaining in divisive times. We have an election coming up. We all know that the vacancy rate has been high on our school boards. The folks that are running for reelection is down. So we're in an area where there's a rate of change. How do you see that? How do you all see that as playing out at the bargaining table, or just not at the table? And I'm sorry if I've narrowed it to that, just with labor relations, because that's where really we're talking about here, the relations that we have with our labor partners. Maybe you'd like to comment on that. Go ahead, Cherise.
I'll add just a few comments, and I'm also looking at some of the questions that are coming in, and I'll say that the times have changed. This is historic level funding coming in, but it is not long-term funding. And so again, knowing your budget and being able to make sure that everyone is aware of, we're not just looking at this year or even next year, but we're looking out at the long term. And as you're doing that, understanding also the political climate that's happening, there's a lot to be gained by really understanding today's reality versus yesterday's reality. Today's reality is that there's lots of pressure on what's happening in the classroom. Today's reality is that there were a lot of challenges that happened through the pandemic that we worked with our labor relation partners to successfully address and have school years that ended as positively as we could in the midst of a global pandemic. But it took the relationships that we had that were built to get there. And because of the pressures that was happening continually on campuses during the pandemic, there's in many cases some level of expectation now that we have had this historic level of funding come in. And you want to be able to, as a board member, really, I think, build on the trust that has been established. You want to be able to think about what things we can do and offer that aren't long-term investments in salaries, because of course that's the first thing that's going to be asked upon. But you want to think about what you can do to provide other supports, like programs that were a part of the pandemic that folks benefited from, that you want to continue. Safety is a huge concern across schools.
Is that still a concern? Do you think it's going to be playing out again this year, Cherise?
Absolutely, and especially in my district, but I do feel like it will be. I think subs, availability of staff, the cost of living, all of that will be a part of what we'll be looking at. And it is on us to really take out as much as we can. Again, thinking about some of the questions here with the elections coming and goals changing and pledges and commitments and promises changing because of the political nature of what's happening across the state. We, as current and hopefully as future elected officials, need to think bigger than that and need to look at that helicopter view again about what is going to be best for the long term, reward and give where we can. We all know that the compensation is not where it needs to be, but we have to look at that within the frame of the long term.
You know, you mentioned that one question that is in the Q&A. If we have a new board, new philosophy of the board, that's a new day in the neighborhood. If it translates, if you've got a proposal and you can't regress, you can't go back on a proposal if that proposal is being made in the fall and you have a new board that comes in. But in terms of the goals and the objectives of the new board, that you have to absorb that. That's right. The political change that just happened. What about this notion? And because we just haven't seen this very often. Oh, I'm sorry, Cherise. I was going to ask.
Give one quick plug, because as those new board members come in, one of the things that's going to, I think, help them is to participate in the Masters in Governance training, because that's going to help ground sometimes you come in as, I call it the fantasy level of all the things you can do and want to do. And then you meet reality. And the Masters in Governance training that's offered through CSBA, I think helps to manage that fantasy versus reality for board members too.
You know what's so helpful about your comment? It's just not Masters in Governments, but it's the AEC. Whenever you can get around your peers, you get around school board members in Northern California, wherever you might be, there's that commonality. You have a commonality. You can share your experiences, and you learn a lot from that. Well, what about the epoch that we're in, this historical time? It's not often that we've got coffers where at least the advertisements were almost, 13% to the good with ongoing money. What's it like to bargain in these times when there's one-time money and ongoing money on the table that it's unprecedented? Do you have thoughts about that, anybody?
If I may, Keith, when we laid out everything ahead of time, when the structure of where we're going, the number comes and fit in that plan. So it doesn't matter if it's 13% or 2% or 17% or 20%. If you have a plan of where you're going, if you have those core values and you know what you're doing, and everybody is transparent about the needs to go where we are, and those numbers will fit. So I'll give an example for us. And somebody asked in the Q&A, what is zero budgeting? So zero budgeting is when you come back and you imagine you just started from scratch. You take everything off every single object code and you literally lay it out like you are starting the business from scratch. It takes a lot of hours, a lot of time, and you're not relying on just transferring things from one year to another year to another year to another year where they become hidden monies and people thinking, well, you allocated this $500,000 for the last 7 years and you never used more than $50,000 in there. So you keep rolling over this 450,000 as a safety net for this project or this. So what happened is when you go to your budgeting, you know exactly what you have, but also doing it that way and having that goal, you know where you're going, the number fits in that. So we told our team when they asked us earlier, when people were not giving percentage and we're able to give a 7% and 10% and 8%, whatever, we were able to go zero budgeting. We were able to find the fat, and what we were able to do, and I know, we all know that we need a 4% every single year ongoing for us just to make up on step and column and your benefits and so on and so forth, to and first. So you need that 4%, and on the top of it, you need more to give. But if you go through the process and you're able to find those savings, and you go and say, this is how I'm able to give you this because all we're doing is with all that transparency. Then when you get the 12%, you say, I can give you 7 or 8 or 9, it's in the clear, it's not a surprise. It's all communication from beginning to end. And I love what Daniel said earlier. It's that open communication, transparency, continue it all the time. So there should be no surprise. I think if there's a surprise, that means there's foundationally something missing in the negotiation process early on, and then you really start building that relationship.
Thank you. Daniel.
I want to add on to what Giovani said, and I was watching the questions come through the Q&A as well, and the title of this is Divisive Times, and we've talked a lot about where we've had successes in establishing trust, and we have some participants today that maybe are in a different part of that journey. And so I think I think there's a couple of things that you can start now, and maybe it's about playing the long game and taking baby steps. So if there isn't trust and you're starting, in our district, we don't do zero-based budgeting, but we do have something. I wish I could take credit for it. I can't, but we have something called a budget review committee. It happens away from the table. It involves our CFO, our superintendent, our deputy superintendent, and bargaining unit leadership. And we open the book and we allow them to go line by line and ask questions. And it's not necessarily from their standpoint coming from a place of distrust. We see it as an opportunity to educate. I mean, really, at the end of the day, you've got to approach it from understanding that we each have our own political realities. And their political reality is that they need to demonstrate some wins for their members. And so if we open up our books and they're going through and they say, what is this 2 million for again? And we say, actually, you know what, that's a carryover for something else. And that kind of falls to the bottom line. Look, what do you know? You've got 1%. And that helps us because it helps them. And so, you know, checking your ego and being willing to actually be transparent and open up some space for that kind of dialogue, they can now go to their members when they've advocated for as much as they can and say, trust us, we got as much as we could, and here's why. And they speak with a level of detail that we don't have to tell that story. So you may not have that trust yet, but just that simple act of making the invitation, which is contrary to the perception of what district management teams are willing to do, can really help start changing the tone at the bargaining table.
Thanks, Daniel. You know, Josh has been doing a little beach time, so I think we're going to ask him the question that's in the chat about whether board members are agents of management. It's kind of a loaded question, but I think that can easily be discussed by this panel. So, John.
No.
Okay, good. So thank you, Josh. You can go back. I mean, I guess we've kind of had the discussion. I mean, they're part of the leadership team and representing, obviously, as an elected official, representing many different constituencies. So is there any more besides the declaration that you can add to?
Yeah, I might respond to an earlier question in the Q&A. You know, as a board member, you're gonna get, my favorite phrase, you're gonna get yelled at a lot, and you'll get yelled at through email. You'll get yelled at, you know, during public comment. You'll get yelled at by your neighbors and at the grocery store and the gas station. And it can be very frustrating as a board member, particularly when what you're getting yelled at about, you know, to be at best incomplete and sometimes outright misleading. And so how do you handle that as a board member? The first is to breathe and to try not to respond when you're sort of in that moment of frustration. And actually the Brown Act helps you in that respect, because you can't respond during a board meeting around negotiation. So even if you wanted to, you can't. When you get those emails from, you know, people that voted for you, that said, hey, I voted for you, and you know, now you're only giving our employees 1%. How dare you? How disrespectful is that? You know, what do you do? Because you know that you're planning on offering more than 1%, or you know that you only offer 1% because they requested 50%. And so you're trying to, like, you know, find that middle ground. My suggestion would be in that context to recognize that the person who is emailing you is not intending to be insulting. They're presuming that what they've been told is the truth, which frankly we all do, right? Like, we read the newspaper, we read a source that we believe to be truthful, and we go from there and make judgments about people in elected office or in, you know, in authority. So it's not, you know, it's not them being any different than any of us. You can say, I so appreciate, you know, your comments. I wish I could speak to you about it, but I'm actually prohibited to doing so. I will definitely take your comment and all the others I receive, you know, into consideration in closed session. And when this is over, I would love to speak with you about the process and what you heard and what I was aware of, and see how those two things are consistent or inconsistent. It's not that you can never talk about it. You just can't talk about it while you're in the midst of negotiations. And, you know, I have found that as a board member, you know, you're not committing to anything, but you're acknowledging that someone is frustrated. You're giving them a voice, making sure that they feel heard in a real way, not in a superficial way. And then you follow up with them. You make a note to yourself and you follow up with them afterwards. And you say, hey, I got your email. I'd love to chat. And they might say, oh, you know, I just got that neighbor said that you guys are being jerks, and, you know, we're good. You guys, you know, I saw your settlement and I'm really proud of you and good job, right? So, you know, it may just be a momentary blip in that person's, but having that correspondence, I think, can be, I think, allows you to just not sit in that frustration, which is a real place for you. It makes you a better board member. And I think it's a genuine opportunity to like make a constituent feel heard while maintaining your, you know, your duties around negotiations.
Well said.
Hey, Keith, can I weigh in real quick on the question of the turnover and change with trustees?
Sure.
Josh made me think of something with his accurate response of no board members, not agents of management.
It was in depth.
It was in depth, it was
And accurate.
accurate, it was spot on, but it triggered something in my head based on some of Giovani's comments about building that trust, right? And this question also goes to it is, especially as we're going into a year where we're likely to have a fair amount of turnover on boards, right? How do you adjust for that when you've set priorities and you've got your plan and you're moving forward and now you've got a whole new board and it only takes
Board,
one.
or we should have a whole new
direction.
board majority. That's right.
Exactly. It only takes one to change it, right? But that speaks to your, I guess, management role as a board, the work you do outside of the negotiation, the work you do at all your board meetings, the work you do at your retreats. You're thinking through not just your LCAP, but what's your mission? What's your vision, right? Like if you are doing all the things you're supposed to be doing as a board member to set the direction and tone for your district, then hopefully that's going to be pervasive enough that when you get those changes on the board that we all know are going to change the personalities, it's going to change the dynamic of how you interact together. At least you've established that sort of core baseline of what does the district stand for and not just the individuals on the board.
Let me go ahead and read a question out of the chat. It goes back to the budgeting aspect. Please describe your budgeting timeline, especially if you would contrast the model of carrying over the same budget year to year as the starting point versus zero-based. Also include, and I think this would be for everybody, what on the timeline is staff only and when the board receives it. Does that ring any bells for anybody? In terms of being able, Giovani, you were the one that answered.
It is really, it's a cycle that we follow continuously. We have a monthly board meeting. We don't have a bi-weekly board meeting. So we do a presentation and we go through it in the same format. So believe it or not, we are in August right now, September coming in, we start cycling in and looking at what does it look like for next year. I will know probably by December, we will have a clear idea, as clear as possible, what is happening already in this year and everything is allocated, how is it moving? So we don't wait till June and go, oh, by the way, this project or this item or this program or this. So we're constantly revisiting. It takes a lot of work on us, the staff. Now, we're a small district, so I do HR and I'm superintendent, and we all wear multiple hats, right? But my CBO and I, we have a standing meeting every single day. Every single day, we have a standing meeting about 15 minutes to 30 minutes that is continuous all year long. So we are constantly going through that cycle. The timeline starts as soon as you roll. It's kind of, if you're familiar with, I heard the story a long time ago, they say when they paint the bridge in San Francisco, right? The Golden Gate Bridge. They start painting it. By the time they finish it, then they start all over again, painting again. It's the same. It's a cycle. It continues. It never stops. You don't take a break and say, okay, now let's see how it's going to play out. So that's how it is. That's how we do it.
You know, we had a question that came in yesterday that I think will be helpful for those that are on the webinar with us. And that question involved, well, what happens when you exchange a proposal and the other side, and this could be either management or labor, I mean, and the other side doesn't agree to change any of the language or agree not at all to make any movement. I mean, it's bargained in good faith. Let's just assume there is consideration and it's all bargained in good faith. But at the end of the line, it's status quo. That one side has said, thank you very much for your proposal. It made us think, but we like the language that we've been living with in our contract and will continue to do so. The question was, well, what can you do? Whether it's our labor partners or whether it's management, what can you do in that situation? And so I think it was mentioned earlier, Josh talked about PERB a little bit. There is a process in California, and I'd give anybody here an opportunity to talk a little bit about the impasse process. and how that is really can create change or can maintain status quo. Anybody want to start that off and not listen to me drone on? I got a timer here. I'm going to give you a couple more seconds. Well,
It sounds like we're at impasse.
Sounds like we're at impasse. I
Well
was just going
played.
back to look. I know there's a specific policy that deals with what do we do on this, and it's blanking.
yeah,
on
and
the
it's
top of
all
my head.
and it's in code and reg. What do you think, Daniel?
I mean, well, I would say this, there obviously are statutory next steps, prescribed next steps in the impasse procedure. So you've got mediation, you've got fact finding, but I think the bottom line is that each step of the process, you still have a chance to resolve things before you continue to move forward. So I think that not having had experience in this district with that process, thankfully, in the time that I've been here, but I would say that I would try to strategize around how you keep the lines of communication open even as you're going through that statutory process, because you can find a way to resolve. Sometimes that might help open up some space that wasn't there before if you're looking for a silver lining, I suppose.
So, you know, a lot of it is timing, right? I mean, it's statutory. You have to apply to PERB to get a mediator. You have to show PERB, you know, what the issues are that you're stuck at, which ones you've already agreed to, how many times you've bargained. You know, there's got to be some information that's provided before they'll provide you a mediator. Once there's a mediator, you know, they just get in between the parties and see if they can move the ball down the field. And sometimes you can reach the mediated settlement. It's what everybody really desires to be. It depends on, you know, the strength and the extent of the issues that are separating the parties. And then there's the fact-finding panel, right? You get to choose one, labor gets to choose one, and PERB puts somebody right in the middle. But eventually, I guess the learning here is eventually, if there have been a disagreement and that disagreement is serious, and say, we're stuck, we can't go any further. And instead of, like Daniel, instead of pushing it maybe into next year's bargaining, believe me, I did that a few times. You just push it, you have a committee, whatever, you just agree with what you've agreed to and move on. If not, you go through this impasse process, which eventually gets back to the board. And the board gets what's a fact-finding recommendation from the panel. And that's only a recommendation. They've got to consider it. You got to at least negotiate and share it and negotiate one more time. I mean, it's all set up to get these parties to agree, because what's the end zone? Well, the end zone is the board can implement the last and the best final offer made by the district. And I've always said, okay, and then the next day, you can get a demand to bargain, and you're back at it. So it's not where you want to go, but it's how the system is set up. Is that a fair description of the process, or did I miss some key steps?
I think you
Jump in?
described it accurately, and I think you described why you want to do everything you can before with having those trusting relationships that are regularly meeting and seeing what reality is, so that you don't have to get there. It's not a good place to be.
And expand on that a little bit, Cherise. It's not a good place to be because of what can happen to the
Well,
relationship, right?
Ultimately, it damages the relationship on the other end. So if you can, and I think it was Daniel, or maybe it was Josh, who was saying there are always opportunities if you are at impasse to continue communicating, to reach some point at which you don't have to continue on to where you might get to, you know, best and final, where people are not happy on either side. You want to strive to have those communication opportunities early on, so that you aren't there. And, you know, I guess it's a reality that some districts have experienced. I know a lot have, but again, you come out on the other side of that having to rebuild almost from scratch, the relationships, the trust, to remove the anger that and the frustration that has developed when you've gone through impasse.
I guess I would in general agree with what Dr. Moore just said. I would say that in most districts in California, there is enough of a relationship where going to impasse would damage that relationship, because how it's typically presented is, the board management, basically is not recognizing the importance of its employees, not valuing them. And so that the messaging tends to be, we're going to this place, fact-finding impasse, because of, there is the board and the district is doing bad things. In a district where there is already a lot of antagonism and distrust between the board and, labor and management, I guess I would offer that there are times when bringing in a mediator is actually helpful.
Yeah.
And you don't have to wait to go to fact-finding or impasse to bring in. You can call PERB right today, and they will bring in someone to help you. So, you don't have to get to that point. And sometimes when there is such mistrust, be it real at the personal level between folks at the table, or more perceived between sort of the generic member of labor and the generic member of management, that being able to say, look, we had this independent person come in and they helped us get to this middle ground, that can help both sides sort of show their need to stay strong and that I didn't give in. And so again, I don't want to recommend going to fact finding like that. And I don't think you need to be like, feel like a failure if you get there, because I do think there are times when that process, bringing in a mediator, can actually, be helpful. It shouldn't be your default, but like sort of on a case-by-case basis, it may be helpful. And you're going to have to weather, if you go that route, just to respond to a comment, that protests, right? You're going to get those emails, you're going to get the board meeting disruptions, you're going to potentially get, people coming to your house, that sort of stuff. So it's not going to be easy, but it may help you find a way through, given that, it's a difficult market right now.
So there's a question in the chat about rate of change, because we're experiencing rate of change, right? Whether it's at the management level with superintendents and assistant supes moving and leaving the district or having a new board. The question is about, well, when the labor association then, sees that there's a rate of change, is there, and they send in maybe one of their more experienced hands really to take advantage of that process. How do you handle that? I mean, that's a good question. How do you handle when the mothership sends in an experienced rep, and you still maintain your relationship with the locals? Any response to that? Anybody want to give that one a twirl? I mean, it is, you're always kind of balancing that, right? Go ahead. Somebody was going to say something. I'll take anything.
I mean, I'll take a stab. I mean, I think that, again, it kind of goes back to that long game. And so you want to create a culture in your system that can withstand transition in people. So if you have a transition in superintendent, if you have a transition in the person in my seat, if you have a transition in the person on the labor side, there are still going to be people connected within the system that can help move that culture forward. And what are the characters, be specific and provide some definition to what are the characteristics that foster that culture, and what does that look like in the day-to-day, and be proactive about implementing those specific things that you've identified that help foster that culture. So I mean, I know that's a very theoretical answer. We haven't had that kind of turnover with our labor folks in San Juan Unified in quite some time. We've had some stable staff leadership on their end, but I think when you're anticipating that kind of change, that's the time to think about what, with some specificity, what has been working and how do we be proactive about trying to fold somebody new into that culture that we've worked really hard over the years to create.
Okay.
It also gets back to I think what a very good point was when you have board member turnover. So, every 2 years, you have the possibility of getting a new board member, new board majority, right? New style. And I think by the way that the question was phrased, I think there was a desire to try to avoid that change. And I would offer that, for CSBA, like CSBA believes in the legitimacy, the power, and the authority of the board. That is CSBA. And so I would offer a different frame that you actually step into that when there is a new board, rather than trying to hold on to what the prior board stated. So for whatever reason, the community has said we want to move in a different direction, whether they're fully educated about it or not, that's the will of the voter, that's local democracy. And so, if you are coming up on a likely transition in board membership, let's say in come November, taking their seats in December or January, I would be cautious about doing too much in the next few months, because a new board might send you in a different direction, and there might be a lot of people, who spend a lot of time now that have to redo things in January. So communicating that to your labor partners, making it clear that that's what's going on, not trying to hide it, making sure that the current board recognizes that there could be a new direction. That's really important. That way you start with your new board on a we support you kind of footing, rather than we want you to do what your predecessors did. And just as a board member, I can tell you, no board member I've ever met ran to do nothing. They always run to do something. And so once they get elected, they're going to want to do something. And so you have to, I think, embrace that and find a way to match what they want to do, with what you're able to do.
Yeah, and to that stepping in, I really like that answer, Josh. The idea of stepping into it also requires some education of those new board members, right? Where are we? And why are we here? What was the strategy that got us to this point? If they're coming in with a different philosophy, the community has elected them, they want to go a different direction, as Josh has said, that's all well and good, but they should understand from where they're starting. Because while most board members come in with an agenda and they want to do something, they're not always fully aware of what's happened in the history. And so getting that grounding is really going to help moving forward and dealing with that system of change.
Well, we've got about 5 minutes left. I think I'll look at the Q&A, but what I'd like to do is kind of start where we started about 90 minutes ago with Cherise, and just any final comments, and then work our way around the screen here. But any final comments for those that are watching this afternoon and later on, because this is going to be accessible by those that weren't able to make it this afternoon. So any final comments?
Well, as a board member who came in with that idea of, I want to do some things, I want to change some things, it was really that fantasy piece of it that was a part of my goal. And having been on the board now for 5 years and understanding and learning more about how things change and how you have to plan for the long term, I would say boards will continually change. The people on the boards will continually change. That's what we want. We don't want things to become set so much where they get stale. And you want to be bringing everything back to those students. I really just think we haven't mentioned students much in this conversation, and our work and our role is about improving opportunities for students, giving them the best educational experience and opportunity possible. And so whatever your goal is as a board member, as long as you keep that front and center, you'll be able to work through negotiating in divisive times, because everyone should have those students at the center of their thoughts. So those are my closing comments.
Thank you, Cherise. I've been calling you Cherise, but Dr. Moore is much more. I mean, you've earned that as well. Hey, Josh. Final comments. I'm going to go, this is a game for my memory to see if I can remember the order I did in the morning, when we started. Josh.
I think Dr. Morse said it best. It's true. We focused a lot on the politics and the legal pieces, but making sure, that is the overlap of everyone in education is about, about the kids and using that to, ground yourselves together. And for those board members who, have been in the job for, a year plus or 3+, whatever it is, just, good luck with negotiations. Make sure to reach out to those who can support you in the process.
Thanks, Josh. Bob?
Yeah, I'd like to really thank those board members that Josh just mentioned and all the rest of you who have been out there for the last 2 years on the front lines of this, whether it's negotiations or anything else. You're really doing very important work when we look at and think about this being centered around our kids, and that's what it's all about. And you guys are on the front lines of some unprecedented times. So mostly my final thoughts are that I just want to thank you all for the service and the jobs you're doing. And if you need to reach out for those resources, we're always here for you at CSBA to help you out with this process. So thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Giovani or Dr. Annous, you've earned that title as well, sir.
Giovanni is good. That's what I was born with, and that's fine. Whatever you come into in education, it's a thankless job. So if you're coming in, you're choosing to do this, my hat is off to you. This is really a service-oriented thing that you want to do. I would encourage those people getting into this from an ego side that this is not the place to be, whatever they're coming in as a new board member or somewhere because of seeking a stepping stone to a higher position or power or this. Definitely, this is not where it is when it comes down to service and serving kids. We are in turning times. There is a turnover in upper management and upper leadership and education that we've never seen in our lifetime. Because of how Hart has been, I know I'm not the only one. I know a lot of colleagues of mine who I know I doubled my blood pressure medication. I take it morning and night. So those people that are sticking into it and coming into it. They're not coming to survive, they're really coming to thrive. So I give my hat off to everybody who is willing to serve in that capacity. And thank you so much for your service if you've been a board member for quite some time. And my final thought is open communication. Our creator, whoever you believe is God, whoever it is that you believe, created us, gave us a brain, a tongue, and facial and body language that we can share and use it. So you can come across to the other side and communicate and always deal from a base of a relationship filled with admiration, trust, and respect. And may the force be with you, right? So thank you.
Thank you, Giovani. Daniel, why don't you wrap it up for us?
Yeah, I don't really know how to follow Dr. Annous, but that was quite inspiring. I want to close out by appreciating something that Josh said earlier. It was a little SEL for board members on in these divisive times, how to regulate your emotions when people are coming in hot, and that was to breathe. And I think that when you are the recipient of people, as someone said, yelling at you, that criticism, maybe people need to escalate a little bit to show that they're rallying the troops. If you can do your best to breathe, don't take it personally, recognize that folks have got a job, and that you're in the driver's seat of getting out what you put into the relationship. Somebody comes to your board meeting and is yelling at you a little bit, reach out to them, buy them coffee, tell them what you heard. I've in each stage of my career, I was originally a journalist. I did PR for a long time, and now I'm a labor negotiator. So I've made a career out of people yelling at me. And so I think that, whatever you can do to keep breathing and keep smiling and keep your focus on centering every conversation on trying to maintain that relationship and what you put into it will help you navigate that divisive period.
Well, I'd like to call on Troy. He's been following this discussion. He's always so good at wrapping things up. I know from my perspective, I'm really appreciate the time that this panel, the wisdom that this panel has imparted on those that tuned in today and will be able to tune in later. So my appreciation to you five. Troy?
I don't think there's too much to add to what our august panel has already said. As a housekeeping detail, I just want everyone to know that you will be able to access a recording of this presentation by Monday, if not sooner. Anyone who's registered will receive an email with the recording of today's webinar. And also, please know that CSBA is always available to help you answer these questions. You can send general information questions to the email address csba@csba.org, and they will get routed to the proper person. And of course, if you have a relationship or have the email address with a CSBA employee, particularly those here on this webinar, you can email them directly. So thank you everyone for your time. Have a good rest of your day, and we will see you at the next webinar.
Bye, everybody. It was a pleasure.